function. So here's the duality piece, right? So on one hand, you could say, yes, it's true. We're all just different waves on the cosmic sea, right? Like that is a fundamental truth. And when you really tap into it, it's freaking intense. Um, and it's also a truth, even though it's not a fundamental, it's more like an illusion, you might say, but it's a really important illusion that in order for this organism here, myself, Paris, right, in order for me to function and meet my needs as a living organism in this world, I have to have a kind of boundary between self and other. I have to have the experience of a boundary between self and other, even if it's partly illusory. And so we often call that the ego, or whatever. And that's kind of the dualistic aspect. And so there's a dilemma there in the sense that on one hand, yes, I have to have an experience of me with my needs, and I have to like function in this world and try to meet my needs and all of that. And also I have, as a social being, I have needs for relationship. I have need relationship with other people and other beings and things like that. So we kind of have this dialectic. On one hand, we have this need for autonomy, for a sense of secure self and empowerment, et cetera. And on the other hand, I have a need for connection with others. So this kind of like, I call that the dualistic or duality sort of dialectic, because dialectic meaning it's both and, like it's not one or the other, like both sets of needs are really important. And so this is the other, you might say, if the basement level of my paradigm is the existential dialectic, this sort of dilemma of like, wow, how do I find security in a world that's fundamentally so insecure? There fundamentally is no self. You could say that's the basement level of my paradigm. The first floor is going to be the dilemma of this kind of relational dialectic. Like, how do I, on one hand, feel empowered and have a sense of autonomy, and on the other hand, feel connected, a sense of belonging and acceptance by others. And so that's when we get into things like attachment theory, we're in that level. And so these are like the two base levels of my whole paradigm. And typically everything else gets built on top of that. And so that's why developmental trauma is so important, because if those two foundations don't get built well, I don't get the sense of a relatively secure self in a relatively secure world. I don't feel like my autonomy and my authenticity is actually loved and accepted by important people in my life. If I don't get those needs met in my early years, that creates a real vulnerability. My skyscraper that gets built on top of that is built on two rotten floors, you might say. And it makes it very likely or possible that my whole skyscraper, my whole paradigm could collapse. And so that's where you might say the predisposition or the vulnerability to psychosis, why it's so correlated with early developmental trauma.